Story 1. The Late Night Dog Walk with Avi. As a high school student, my demanding schedule typically involves balancing academic commitments, extracurricular engagements, and household duties. Consequently, by the conclusion of most days, my energy reserves are significantly depleted. Adding to this, I am responsible for my lively 2-year-old dog, Avi, who will not allow me to overlook her essential walks. Possessing an abundance of energy, she becomes agitated and prone to accidents on the carpets if her regular outings are neglected. My parents have entrusted me with her care, so even when I am overwhelmed with tasks, I must find a way to integrate her needs into my daily routine. One particular evening, I returned home considerably later than usual due to a school club function. The bus services were experiencing delays, and by the time I finally stepped through the front door, it was already approaching 9 p.m. Awaiting me were household chores and academic assignments. I made the decision to address these responsibilities first, intending to walk Avi afterward. This process consumed far more time than anticipated, and upon my final check of the clock, it was drawing perilously close to midnight. At that juncture, I was utterly exhausted. However, Avi was relentless in her insistence. She persisted in whining, pawing at my leg, and trailing me until I ultimately yielded, retrieving her leash. My residential area is structured like a large square, intersected by smaller thoroughfares with only a sparse scattering of streetlights. While the nearby main road is adequately illuminated, the interior of the complex quickly succumbs to darkness. That night, given my extreme fatigue, I was not particularly attentive as I embarked upon the walk. I had taken numerous late-night strolls before, and typically, the neighborhood was tranquil as most residents were older and usually asleep by that hour. I progressed around the square, reaching approximately the halfway point when I observed another individual ahead of me. This was uncommon, as encountering anyone out so late was a rarity. The man had his hood drawn up, a cap positioned beneath it, and his attire rendered his face largely indistinguishable. What particularly surprised me was that he also had a dog accompanying him. I did not recognize either the man or his canine companion, which was noteworthy since most dog owners in my neighborhood are acquainted with one another. His dog appeared to be a pit bull, though somewhat smaller than typical for the breed. Avi is generally good-natured and composed, but she possesses an uncanny ability to sense when something is amiss. When she barks, it is invariably for a valid reason. Initially, she displayed an inclination to approach and investigate the other dog. However, her entire demeanor abruptly shifted. Within moments, she commenced barking and growling with frantic intensity, straining against her leash in an attempt to retreat. The man promptly pulled his dog back. Yet, instead of merely departing, he repeatedly cast quick glances in my direction as he walked away. Being half asleep and preoccupied with calming Avi, I did not dwell on the encounter at that moment. I continued along the pathway, but the further I advanced, the more uneasy I became. The streetlights provided minimal illumination, leaving extensive stretches shrouded in darkness. As I traversed one of the lit sections, I suddenly perceived the man once more, standing at the periphery of the light, almost as if he were waiting. He was no longer engaged in walking his dog. He was simply standing there, facing away, until I drew near. The instant Avi noticed him again, she became frantic, barking even more vociferously than before. My intuition strongly advised me against approaching him. Consequently, I crossed to the opposite side of the street, endeavoring to appear nonchalant. When I glanced back, he was staring directly at me, and something about the intensity of his gaze caused my entire body to tense up. Following that, I did not hesitate. I began to run. Initially, I thought he might simply disregard me, but then I distinctly heard the accelerating sound of footsteps behind me, accompanied by his dog. Adrenaline surged through me, and despite having been out of practice since the conclusion of cross-country season, I propelled myself to run faster. Avi effortlessly kept pace, but the sound of him pursuing us intensified my panic even further. Instead of heading directly home, a course I recognized as risky if he were to discover my residence, I diverted toward a nearby recreational area and navigated through one of the narrow passages. For a brief moment, I believed I had eluded him, but then Avi's jingling collar betrayed our position, and I heard him resuming his pursuit. I swiftly scooped her up and sprinted down another narrow alley dense with tall grass, my sole focus being escape. That route eventually led to the main road, which was brighter and more exposed. I executed a sharp turn and sprinted until my chest burned with exertion. When I finally attempted to retrieve my phone to summon assistance, I realized its battery had expired earlier in the evening. At that precise instant, I heard his dog barking again, sounding closer than I wished to acknowledge. Completely breathless and utterly terrified, I resorted to the only course of action I could conceive. I screamed at the absolute peak of my lungs while continuing to run. The commotion must have attracted attention because a car abruptly pulled up alongside me, and the driver lowered the window, shouting. It was one of my neighbors, a middle-aged woman who recognized me. The man who had been chasing me immediately halted, turned, and vanished back in the direction from which he had come. I collapsed onto the ground right there, completely exhausted, while Avi behaved as though nothing untoward had transpired. My neighbor exited her vehicle, initially reprimanding me for screaming so loudly, but then altered her tone once I elucidated the events that had unfolded. She drove me back to my home, where my parents were anxiously awaiting. Following that unsettling night, I vowed to myself that I would never again take Avi for such late-hour walks. Story 2. The unnerving encounter near a medical campus. This incident occurred approximately a year ago, subsequent to a late evening spent with my girlfriend. I had cultivated the routine of escorting her home, irrespective of the hour, partly out of a desire to ensure her safe return, but also because I genuinely enjoyed the walk itself. It afforded me additional time with her, and typically, I would receive a warm embrace or a kiss at her doorstep before commencing my journey back. My residence is not particularly distant, requiring about a half hour on foot, so on most nights, it presented no significant challenge. However, on the specific night I recount, I was not in optimal condition for walking. A few days prior, I had sustained a twisted ankle while playing ball. While not a severe injury, it continued to cause discomfort if I moved incorrectly. Under normal circumstances, I could have simply utilized the public transport system to return home. But we had remained out later than usual, closer to 2 o'clock in the morning, and the final bus departs around midnight. This left me with no alternative but to navigate the streets with a noticeable limp. There is one aspect of this particular route that invariably lends it an unsettling quality. To reach my neighborhood, one must traverse an area adjacent to a sizable psychiatric hospital. This institution occupies a considerable expanse of land. While a longer alternative route existed that would have allowed me to bypass it, doing so would have added an extra 30 minutes to my journey, a strain my injured ankle simply could not endure. I had walked past this hospital countless times, so it wasn't that I harbored a fear of the place. Nevertheless, by night, the grounds presented a dramatically different appearance. The illumination failed to cover every corner, and the enormous shadows cast across the buildings imbued the site with the ambiance less of a medical campus and more of something drawn from an urban legend. That night, I was wearing headphones, experimenting with some beatboxing as I approached the entrance gates. It was not my first time passing this location after dark, and usually it remained quiet. Perhaps a light or two would be visible in one of the wings, but nothing particularly striking. My friends and I had even engaged in ball games on the court there in the past, so I was intimately familiar with the layout. Still, undertaking a solitary walk at 2 o'clock in the morning past a sprawling psychiatric hospital provided ample motivation to quicken my pace somewhat. I was nearly at the bus stop situated near the corner when I perceived someone. Initially, I assumed he was merely a random individual awaiting something. Yet, there was an unusual quality to his posture. He was not gazing down at a mobile phone or checking his wristwatch. Instead, his focus was rigidly fixed on something across the street. From my vantage point, I was unable to discern what he was staring at, as the opposing side of the road was entirely vacant. There were no vehicles parked, no illuminated houses, nothing at all. I instinctively decelerated my pace and removed one earbud to enhance my hearing. My hand automatically delved into my pocket where I stored my keys, orienting one between my fingers as a precautionary measure. It wasn't that his attire was peculiar. He actually appeared like any ordinary individual in casual clothing. However, his unyielding, rigid stance made me profoundly uneasy. Even as I drew nearer and walked past him, he neither moved nor acknowledged my presence, a fact that, to be frank, intensified my apprehension. The truly strange part, however, transpired immediately after I had passed him. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard the distinct sound of his shoes impacting the pavement behind me. He was not running, merely walking, yet the timing seemed far too precise to be mere happenstance. I sought to suppress panic, maintaining a steady pace and feigning normalcy. Internally, however, my chest felt constricted. Without music filling my ears, I could clearly hear his footsteps mirroring my own, making it unequivocally evident that he was pursuing me. Instead of proceeding straight, which would have led me through some less illuminated sections of the street, I elected to turn right into a side street that culminated in a cul-de-sac. It might sound ill-advised to venture into a dead end, but having grown up in that neighborhood, I was intimately familiar with its various shortcuts and back ways. I possessed the ability to bypass fences and cut across open yards with greater speed than most people would anticipate. As I turned down the street, I caught a fleeting reflection of him in the glass of a nearby building. He stumbled for a fraction of a second, as though my sudden turn had taken him by surprise, but then swiftly regained his composure and continued his pursuit. At that moment, I ceased to hold back. I pushed through the discomfort in my ankle and accelerated, feigning an intention to enter one of the building's entrances. At the last possible second, I veered sharply and vaulted over a low fence that demarcated the street from a grassy expanse. I did not pause to ascertain if he followed. I simply maintained my momentum until I had penetrated deeply enough into the neighborhood that his footsteps were no longer audible. When I finally mustered the courage to look back, the street was entirely deserted. I arrived home not long thereafter, limping more severely than before, yet profoundly grateful to have made it back safely. I never encountered the man again. Subsequent to the incident, rumors circulated that a couple of patients had reportedly absconded from the hospital around that period, but I never definitively ascertained the veracity of those claims. The crucial point is, he did not resemble the patients I had previously observed. He seemed far too alert, too sharp. Irrespective of his identity, I am simply relieved that I never had to find out. Story 3. The Perilous Drive Home from Jack's Gathering. When I was approximately 15 years old, I habitually spent most weekends staying at my best friend Talia's residence. Her home was situated closer to the town center than mine, rendering it a de facto gathering point for the remainder of our social circle. On that particular weekend, two of our other companions, Jade and Shauna, also joined us. We were engaged in a typical sleepover-style evening until Jack, a friend residing across town, extended an invitation for us to come over. His place wasn't excessively far, perhaps a mere 10-minute walk, but given that it was already after nightfall, Talia opted to remain behind. She harbored a strong aversion to walking late at night, but the three of us concluded that our combined presence would ensure our safety. Upon our arrival at Jack's, the atmosphere was chaotic from the outset. Jack, being 17, had already accessed his mother's alcohol supply. Furthermore, several individuals we barely knew were present, consuming substantial amounts of liquor and engaging in arguments. It was decidedly not the kind of evening we had envisioned. One of the girls, utterly intoxicated, latched onto me and commenced unburdening herself of all her personal tribulations. She spoke of her desire to terminate her current relationship and her lingering feelings for her ex-boyfriend, an entire dramatic saga. Although I barely knew her, I allowed her to continue her rambling. Eventually, as the hour grew late, nearing midnight, Jade and Shauna resolved to depart. They contacted Talia's mother for a ride home, as the prospect of walking back across town at such a late hour held no appeal. I, however, found myself in a predicament. The inebriated girl implored me to stay, asserting that she did not wish to be left alone with her boyfriend. For some inexplicable reason, I acquiesced. At that time, I considered myself quite resilient. Even at school, people had cultivated an image of me as the formidable goth girl who invariably carried a pocket knife. Consequently, I assumed that walking home alone later would not pose a significant challenge. Around midnight, I finally departed from Jack's house. As I commenced my walk, I messaged Jade, ensuring she would remain awake to unlock the door upon my arrival. The streets were profoundly quiet, and even though I wasn't precisely frightened, the pervasive silence put me on edge. I maintained a brisk pace, almost jogging, as the notion of being solitary in the heart of town at that hour felt profoundly unsettling. As I reached Main Street, the final segment before Talia's house, I observed a car approaching from my right. It was still some distance away, traveling at speed, so I hurried across the street before it reached the intersection. The moment I stepped onto the opposing side, the car screeched to an abrupt halt and aggressively swerved onto the very road I was taking. The piercing sound of tires grating against the pavement immediately propelled me into a state of survival mode. I promptly sought concealment within a dense row of bushes in front of a nearby residence. Fortunately, my attire, being entirely black from head to toe, allowed me to merge seamlessly with the shadows. From my hiding place, I observed the car slowly advance down the street, moving at a deliberate, creeping pace. Its headlights systematically swept across the road, as if meticulously searching for something or someone. My chest constricted as I held my breath, striving to maintain absolute silence. The vehicle reached the end of the block, executed a circular maneuver in a parking lot, and then returned along the same route. The instant it turned back toward Main Street, I burst into a sprint. My legs propelled me with a velocity I had not thought possible. Simultaneously, I fumbled with my antiquated flip phone, frantically sending urgent messages to Jade, instructing her to open the door immediately. With every step closer to Talia's house, I had an overwhelming premonition that the car would come roaring back. And indeed, it did. Just as I reached Talia's porch, gasping for air, the car came hurtling down the same road, its engine revving ferociously, as if its occupant was enraged at my evasion. The timing was astonishingly precise. Jade flung the door open just as I ascended the steps, and I dove inside. We forcefully shut and locked the door, whereupon I finally recounted the entire terrifying incident. She gazed at me with wide eyes, struggling to comprehend the gravity of what had just transpired. The following morning, when we informed Talia and her mother, the reaction was instantaneous. Her mother's face blanched as she retrieved a news article she had recently perused. The report detailed the apprehension of a man in an adjacent town for stalking and assaulting women late at night, driving the identical make and model of car I had encountered. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. That car was not merely driven by some random inebriated individual. It could have been the very same perpetrator. Reflecting upon it now, years later, I am profoundly grateful that I heeded my instincts and concealed myself when I did. Had I continued walking, exposed in the open, my safe return might not have been possible at all. Story 4: The Van and the Pursuit. When I was 14 years old, an event occurred that continues to evoke a profound sense of unease whenever it resurfaces in my thoughts. My parents had departed for the evening to dine with some family friends, leaving me alone at home. I resided in a tranquil neighborhood where most residents routinely left their doors unlocked, and for the most part, a mutual trust permeated the community. It was the kind of locale where nothing genuinely dramatic ever transpired, which is precisely why the events of that night still retain such a surreal quality. A neighbor had requested my assistance in caring for her dog while she and her family were vacationing. The duties were straightforward: a couple of brief walks, providing food and water, and ensuring the dog was secured for the night. Around 10:30 p.m., I embarked on the final walk of the day. The streets were deserted, the air was refreshingly cool, and I genuinely found enjoyment in the short journey to her residence. Every aspect of the night felt entirely normal until I commenced my return trip home. After securing her house, I stepped onto the driveway and immediately observed a van parked a few houses down that had not been there previously. The engine was not running, but two men were seated in the front, visibly arguing and gesticulating at one another, their voices audibly carried down the street. As soon as they spotted me, the man occupying the passenger seat swiftly exited the vehicle. He moved with alacrity onto the opposite sidewalk, proceeding in the same direction as me, albeit slightly behind. I was not yet in a state of panic, but something about the persistent way he kept glancing over at me caused my stomach to knot with apprehension. He quickened his pace, maintaining alignment with me from across the street, his gaze unbroken. My grip instinctively tightened around the keys clutched in my hand, and my legs yearned to run, but I forcefully compelled myself to maintain a steady walking pace. A few seconds later, he began to cross the street, and I froze. By then, he was only a couple of feet away. His hand slowly ascended as though he were about to place it on my shoulder. The very instant his fingers grazed me, adrenaline surged through my system. I spun around abruptly and bolted toward the nearest backyard. He emitted a short gasp as if my sudden flight had taken him by surprise. Then I heard the rapid pounding of his footsteps in pursuit. I darted between fences and gardens, intentionally taking a circuitous route home, because the last thing I desired was to inadvertently lead him directly to my front door, where the waiting van could effortlessly pull up. I could discern his breathing growing louder, heavier, and then, mercifully, more distant, indicating he was struggling to keep pace. Ahead of me, I discerned the wide opening of a storm drain, one of those concrete conduits that extended beneath the street. Without a moment's hesitation, I squeezed myself inside, crouching low against the curved wall, and covered my mouth to muffle my breathing. My entire body trembled uncontrollably to stay still, fervently hoping he would not discover me. Minutes elongated into what felt like hours. Eventually, I heard the distinct sound of a car door slamming shut and an engine igniting. The van then pulled away, and the street once again descended into silence. I remained within that pipe for a duration longer than was likely necessary, approximately 20 minutes before I finally crawled back out. My legs felt as though they could barely support me, but I forced myself to run the remaining distance home. By the time I burst through the door, my vision was blurred from shock and exertion, I dropped my keys, stumbled into the bathroom, and became physically ill before collapsing onto the floor. The full impact of what had just transpired did not truly hit me until I was curled up there, weeping alone in the darkness. I never disclosed the incident to my parents or contacted the police, partly due to my fear of reprimand for being out so late, and partly because I believed I had managed the situation myself. Looking back now, I fully grasp the profound seriousness of the event and the recklessness of my silence. For many months afterward, I struggled to sleep soundly through the night. Even now, years later, I still find myself instinctively scanning the street whenever the idling engine of a van is audible nearby. I will never definitively ascertain the intentions of those men. However, the manner in which one of them pursued me while the other waited in the van still leads me to believe their motives were sinister. I can only hope they never attempted such a thing with anyone else. Story 5. The Stalker in the Pickup Truck. During my middle school years, my mother maintained a consistent nightly ritual of taking late evening walks, sometimes closer to midnight than to 10 p.m. She affirmed that these strolls aided her in achieving mental clarity after the day's events, and she appreciated the profound quietness of the neighborhood once most residents had retired for the night. Our residential area was not precisely secluded. It was a quintessential suburban development. However, one of its boundaries adjoined a moderately trafficked road that served as a link between two larger thoroughfares within the town. Vehicles continued to pass by at that hour, though not continuously, meaning the road could feel simultaneously exposed and isolated, depending on the specific moment. One particular night, she embarked on her walk as usual, commencing down our winding street toward the stop sign where it intersected with the main road. From that point, her established routine involved turning right and proceeding along a stretch until she reached another connecting road, which eventually looped back into the neighborhood from the opposite side. The walk itself was not exceptionally long, perhaps 20 minutes if she maintained a brisk pace, but it provided ample solitude she sought. Not long after she executed the turn onto the busier road, a dark pickup truck approached from the opposing lane. She initially paid it little heed until she observed it swerving into a driveway a short distance ahead, pausing there for a brief period and then executing a U-turn. The truck then passed her again, heading back in the direction from which it had originally come. At first, she dismissed it as merely someone missing a turn or realizing they were proceeding incorrectly. It was not until the truck reappeared, this time pulling into a different driveway closer to the connector road and lingering for an extended duration, that she began to experience a profound sense of unease. When it passed her for the second time, it did not merely drive by, it noticeably slowed down. She could clearly perceive the driver staring intently in her direction, and at that precise moment, her apprehension spiked considerably. She continued walking, feigning unawareness, but the repeated pattern of the truck's movements was now far too peculiar to disregard. The truck proceeded to the intersection, turned onto the side street, and then pulled into the very first driveway. On this occasion, the headlights abruptly switched to high beams as the driver commenced another U-turn. By that point, my mother was faced with a critical decision. She was sufficiently close that if she sprinted through the neighboring yards, she could cut directly home. However, she instinctively knew that if she bolted straight for the house, whoever was inside that truck might ascertain her place of residence. The thought of inadvertently leading them directly to our front door was a prospect far more terrifying than remaining in the open. Instead, she veered off into one of the yards adjacent to the road and crouched behind a substantial tree and a shed, pressing herself deeply into the shadows. From that concealed vantage point, she possessed an unobstructed view of the street without herself being visible. She remained absolutely motionless, intently listening to the truck as it slowly rolled back onto the main road. It did not accelerate away. It idled there for a moment before deliberately turning into our neighborhood. Her heart was pounding ferociously because she understood that it was not merely passing through. The driver was proceeding at an unhurried pace, almost creeping, as they navigated their way down our street. The truck advanced as far as the curve near our house and lingered there for a brief while before pulling into the driveway of a neighbor 3 houses down to execute a turn. The high beams then clicked off, and the truck eased back onto the road before departing via the same route it had initially entered. Even after witnessing its departure, she remained hidden for several additional minutes, ensuring with absolute certainty that it was gone before she emerged from the shadows. Then she hastened through the yards as rapidly as she could until she was safely back within our home. Following that night, she consciously avoided her former route for a considerable period, opting for alternative streets whenever she desired a late-night walk. And she never truly forgot the unsettling sensation of being so closely watched and pursued. Story 6. The Unforgettable Man in the Shadows. As a child, I resided just beyond the city limits, in an area where the neighborhood still had an unfinished, partially developed feel. While the main thoroughfares were paved, a significant number of the side streets remained unpaved dirt and gravel, and functional streetlights were sparsely distributed, appearing only every few blocks. At night, this environment transformed into vast expanses of darkness, punctuated by intermittent patches of light emanating from a porch here or there. My closest friend lived 1 block away at the terminus of a cul-de-sac, and I spent a considerable portion of my youth traversing that path after dusk. In those days, none of us gave a second thought to being out late without parental supervision. It was simply a common practice among children. One particular night, I departed from his house earlier than originally planned because I found myself unable to comfortably fall asleep on his couch. I checked the time as I slipped on my shoes. It was just after 3 in the morning. He was profoundly asleep, and I concluded it wasn't worth disturbing him simply to announce my departure. The walk home was brief, barely 5 minutes. However, those 5 minutes felt notably longer than usual that night. The air was heavy with dampness, and a thick mist enveloped everything, causing every sound to become sharper. The crunching of gravel beneath each step was distinctly audible, echoing as if across the entire block. As I walked down his street, I experienced that pervasive, restless sensation one gets when attempting to prevent one's mind from wandering, yet struggling to concentrate on any single thought. Occasionally, I would hum or contemplate a television program to divert my attention. But on that specific night, I was so utterly exhausted that I couldn't maintain focus on any thought for an extended period. All I distinctly recall is a growing sense of unease as I progressed toward the long, unlit stretch of road. The only source of illumination originated from a few porches scattered widely apart, and the remainder of the street simply dissolved into profound blackness. Precisely as I stepped into one of those dark, unlit sections, a memory from earlier that summer spontaneously emerged in my mind. My mother had informed me that a registered individual of concern resided somewhere along my friend's street. She had once seen the man at a park and had emphatically warned me to steer clear of his residence. I was attempting to recall which particular house she had indicated when I perceived something moving ahead. Initially, I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, but then my eyes adjusted, and it appeared as though someone was standing perfectly still at the edge of a driveway. The form was tall and rigid, blending almost seamlessly with a trash can positioned near the curb. I continued walking, casting sideways glances so as not to appear overtly staring, and the closer I got, the more firmly convinced I became that it was, indeed, a person. My chest tightened, and my heart was pounding so intensely that I felt I could hear its reverberations in my ears. It was at that moment that I caught my foot on a rock embedded in the dirt and fell heavily, scraping both my knee and elbow. The sound must have been considerable because by the time I lifted my gaze, someone was looming over me. It was an older man I had never before encountered. His hair and beard were both conspicuously white. His face appeared gaunt and hollowed, as though he had not consumed adequate nourishment in weeks, and his skin bore a pallid, washed-out complexion under the moonlight. He bent down, gripping my shoulders with surprising firmness, and effortlessly pulled me upright. For a moment I was utterly paralyzed, merely staring into his sunken eyes. He uttered a soft, "Hello," and then placed one hand on me in a manner that completely froze me rigid. In that instant, it felt as though every ounce of energy within my body was instantly drained away. I cannot recall precisely how I managed to move, but primal instinct suddenly seized control. I violently wrenched myself free of his grasp, and instead of pursuing me, he simply remained standing there, almost as if he had anticipated my departure. I sprinted with a fervor I believed myself incapable of, not halting until I reached the corner where my street intersected with his. When I finally dared to glance back, he was still standing in the identical spot, utterly unmoving, observing my flight. By the time I made it inside, my mother was initially furious, assuming I had merely injured myself from carelessly playing outdoors. However, her anger dissipated once she grasped the true nature of what had transpired. We contacted the police, and I provided the most comprehensive description of the man I could offer. He did not match the profile of the registered offender she had previously cautioned me about, meaning it was an entirely different individual. Nothing concrete ever resulted from the report, and my mother surmised he might have been an unhoused man who had wandered into the neighborhood. Irrespective of his identity, after that night, I ceased walking alone after dark. Even now, years later, I continue to dream about that white-haired man, perpetually standing frozen in the shadows, patiently awaiting my passage.